It was the year of the behemoth, the month of the hedgehog, the day of the toad. A hot late summer sun was sinking down toward evening over the sombre, fertile land of Lankhmar. Peasants toiling in the endless grain fields paused for a moment and lifted their earth-stained faces and noted that it would soon be time to commence lesser chores. Cattle cropping the stubble began to move in the general direction of home. Sweaty merchants and shopkeepers decided to wait a little longer before enjoying the pleasures of the bath. Thieves and astrologers moved restlessly in their sleep, sensing that the hours of night and work were drawing near. At the southernmost limit of the land of Lankhmar, a day's ride beyond the village of Soriv, where the grain fields give way to rolling forests of maple and oak, two horsemen cantered leisurely along a narrow, dusty road. They presented a sharp contrast. The larger wore a tunic of unbleached linen, drawn tight at the waist by a very broad leather belt. A fold of linen cloak was looped over his head as a protection against the sun. A long sword with a pomegranate-shaped golden pommel was strapped to his side. Behind his right shoulder, a quiver of arrows jutted up. Half-sheathed in a saddle case was a thick yew-bow, unstrung. His great lean muscles, white skin, copper hair, green eyes, and above all, the pleasant yet untamed expression of his massive countenance, all hinted at a land of origin colder, rougher, and more barbarous than that of Lankhmar. Even as everything about the larger man suggested the wilderness, so the general appearance of the smaller man, and he was considerably smaller, spoke of the city. His dark face was that of a jester. Bright black eyes, snub nose, and little lines of irony about the mouth. Hands of a conjurer. Something about the set of his wiry frame betokening exceptional competence in street fights and tavern brawls. He was clad from head to foot in garments of grey silk, soft and curiously loose of weave. His slim sword, cased in grey mousekin, was slightly curved toward the tip. From his belt hung a sling and a pouch of missiles. Despite their many dissimilarities, it was obvious that the two men were comrades, that they were united by a bond of subtle mutual understanding, woven of melancholy, humor, and many another strand. The smaller rode a dappled grey mare, the larger a chestnut gelding. They were nearing a point where the narrow road came to the end of a rise, made a slight turn, and wound down into the next valley. Green walls of leaves pressed in on either side. The heat was considerable, but not oppressive. It brought to mind thoughts of satyrs and centaurs dozing in hidden glades. Then the grey mare, slightly in the lead, whinnied. The smaller man tightened his hold on the reins, his black eyes darting quick, alert glances, first to one side of the road and then to the other. There was a faint scraping sound, as of wood on wood. Without warning, the two men ducked down, clinging to the side harness of their horses. Simultaneously came the musical twang of bowstrings, like the prelude of some forest concert, and several arrows buzzed angrily through the spaces that had just been vacated. Then the mare and the gelding were around the turn and galloping like the wind, their hooves striking up great puffs of dust. From behind came excited shouts and answers as the pursuit got underway. There seemed to have been fully 7 or 8 men in the ambuscade, squat, sturdy rogues wearing chainmail shirts and steel caps. Before the mare and the gelding had gone a stone's throw down the road, they were out and after, a black horse in the lead, a black-bearded rider second. But those pursued were not wasting time. The larger man rose to a stand in his stirrups, whipping the yew-bow from its case. With his left hand, he bent it against the stirrup. With his right, he drew the upper loop of the string into place. Then his left hand slipped down the bow to the grip, and his right reached smoothly back over his shoulder for an arrow. Still guiding his horse with his knees, he rose even higher and turned in his saddle and sent an eagle-feathered shaft whirring. Meanwhile, his comrade had placed a small leaden ball in a sling, whirled it twice about his head, so that it hummed stridently, and loosed his cast. Arrow and missile sped and struck together. The one pierced the shoulder of the leading horseman, and the other smote the second on his steel cap and tumbled him from his saddle. The pursuit halted abruptly in a tangle of plunging and rearing horses. The men who had caused this confusion pulled up at the next bend in the road and turned back to watch. "By the hedgehog," said the smaller, grinning wickedly. "But they will think twice before they play at ambuscades again." "Blundering fools," said the larger. "Haven't they even learned to shoot from their saddles? I tell you, Grey Mouser, it takes a barbarian to fight his horse properly." "Except for myself and a few other people," replied the one who bore the feline nickname of Grey Mouser. "But look, Fafford, the rogues retreat bearing their wounded, and one gallops far ahead. Pshaw! But I dinted Blackbeard's pate for him. He hangs over his nag like a bag of meal. If he'd have known who we were, he wouldn't have been so hot in the chase." There was some truth to this last boast. The names of the Grey Mouser and the northerner Farford were not unknown in the lands around Lochmar, and in proud Lochmar too. Their taste for strange adventure, their mysterious comings and goings, and their odd sense of humor were matters that puzzled almost all men alike. Abruptly, Fafford unstrung his bow and turned forward in his saddle. "This should be the very valley we are seeking," he said. "See? There are the two hills, each with two close-set humps of which the document speaks. Let's have another look at it to test my guess." The Grey Mouser reached into his capacious leather pouch and withdrew a page of thick vellum, ancient and curiously greenish. 3 edges were frayed and worn. The 4th showed a clean and recent cut. It was inscribed with the intricate hieroglyphs of Lochmarian writing, done in the black ink of the squid. But it was not to these that the Mouser turned his attention, but to several faint lines of diminutive red script written into the margin. These he read: "Let kings stack their treasure houses ceiling high, and merchants burst their vaults with hoarded coin, and fools envy them. I have a treasure that outvalues theirs. A diamond as big as a man's skull, 12 rubies each as big as the skull of a cat, 17 emeralds each as big as the skull of a mole, and certain rods of crystal and bars of orichalcum. Let overlords swagger jewel-bedecked and queens load themselves with gems, and fools adore them. I have a treasure that will outlast theirs. A treasure house have I builded for it in the far southern forest, where the 2 hills hump double like sleeping camels, a day's ride beyond the village of Sorive. A great treasure house with a high tower, fit for a king's dwelling, yet no king may dwell there. Immediately below the keystone of the chief dome, my treasure lies hid, eternal as the glittering stars. It will outlast me and my name, I, Urgaan of Anganji. It is my hold on the future. Let fools seek it. They shall win it not. For although my treasure house be empty as air, no deadly creature in rocky lair, no sentinel outside anywhere, no pitfall, poison, trap, or snare, above and below the whole place bare, of demon or devil not a hair, nor serpent lethal-fanged yet fair, no skull with mortal eye aglare, yet have I left a guardian there. Let the wise read this riddle, and forbear." "The man's mind runs to skulls," muttered the Mouser. "He must have been a grave digger, or a necromancer." "Or an architect," observed Fafford thoughtfully. "In those past days when graven images of the skulls of men and animals served to bedeck temples." "Perhaps," agreed the Mouser. "Surely the writing and ink are old enough. They date at least as far back as the century of the wars with the East. 5 long lifespans. The Mouser was an accomplished forger, both of handwriting and of objects of art. He knew what he was talking about. Satisfied that they were near the goal of their quest, the 2 comrades gazed through a break in the foliage down into the valley. It was shaped like the inside of a pod, shallow, long, and narrow. They were viewing it from one of the narrow ends. The 2 peculiarly humped hills formed the long sides. The whole of the valley was green with maple and oak, save for a small gap toward the middle. That, thought the Mouser, might mark a peasant's dwelling and the cleared space around it. Beyond the gap he could make out something dark and squarish rising a little above the treetops. He called his companions' attention to it, but they could not decide whether it was indeed a tower, such as the document mentioned, or just a peculiar shadow, or perhaps even the dead, limbless trunk of a gigantic oak. It was too far away. "Almost sufficient time has passed," said Fafford after a pause, "for one of those rogues to have sneaked up through the forest for another shot at us. Evening draws near." They spoke to their horses and moved on slowly. They tried to keep their eyes fixed on the thing that looked like a tower, but since they were descending, it almost immediately dropped out of sight below the treetops. There would be no further chance of seeing it until they were quite close at hand. The Mouser felt a subdued excitement running through his flesh. Soon they would discover if there was a treasure to be had or not. A diamond as big as a man's skull, rubies, emeralds. He found an almost nostalgic delight in prolonging and savoring to the full this last leisurely stage of their quest. The recent ambuscade served as a necessary spice. He thought of how he had slit the interesting-looking vellum page from the ancient book on architecture that reposed in the library of the rapacious and overbearing Lord Ranosh. Of how, half in jest, he had sought out and interrogated several peddlers from the south. Of how he had found one who had recently passed through a village named Sorive. Of how that one had told him of a stone structure in the forest south of Sorive called by the peasants the House of Anganji, and reputed to be long deserted. The peddler had seen a high tower rising above the trees. The Mouser recalled the man's wizened, cunning face and chuckled. And that brought to mind the greedy, sallow face of Lord Ranosh. And a new thought occurred to him. "Fafford," he said, "those rogues we just now put to flight, what did you take them for?" The northerner grunted humorous contempt. "Run-of-the-manger ruffians, waylayers of fat merchants, pasture bravos, bumpkin bandits." Still, they were all well armed and armed alike, as if they were in some rich man's service. And that one who rode far ahead, mightn't he have been hastening to report failure to some master? What is your thought? The Mouser did not reply for some moments. "I was thinking," he said, "that Lord Ranosh is a rich man and a greedy one, who slavers at the thought of jewels. And I was wondering if he ever read those faint lines of red lettering and made a copy of them, and if my theft of the original sharpened his interest." The northerner shook his head. "I doubt it. You're oversubtle. But if he did, and if he seeks to rival us in this treasure quest, he'd best watch each step twice, and choose servitors who can fight on horseback." They were moving so slowly that the hooves of the mare and the gelding hardly stirred of the dust. They had no fear of danger from the rear. A well-laid ambuscade might surprise them, but not a man or horse in motion. The narrow road wound along in a purposeless fashion. Leaves brushed their faces, and occasionally they had to swing their bodies out of the way of encroaching branches. The ripe scent of the late summer forest was intensified, now that they were below the rim of the valley. Mingled with it were whiffs of wild berries and aromatic shrubs. Shadows imperceptibly lengthened. 9 chances out of 10 murmured the Mouser dreamily. The treasure house of Ergan of Arganji was looted some 100 years ago by men whose bodies are already dust. It may be so, agreed Fafhrd. Unlike men, rubies and emeralds do not rest quietly in their graves. This possibility, which they had discussed several times before, did not disturb them now or make them impatient. Rather did it impart to their quest the pleasant melancholy of a lost hope. They drank in the rich air and let their horses munch random mouthfuls of leaves. A jay called shrilly from overhead, and off in the forest a catbird was chattering, their sharp voices breaking in on the low buzzing and droning of the insects. Night was drawing near. The almost horizontal rays of the sun gilded the treetops. Then Fafhrd's sharp ears caught the hollow lowing of a cow. A few more turns brought them into the clearing they had spied. In line with their surmise, it proved to contain a peasant's cottage, a neat little low-eaved house of weathered wood, situated in the midst of an acre of grain. To one side was a bean patch, to the other a wood pile which almost dwarfed the house. In front of the cottage stood a wiry old man, his skin as brown as his homespun tunic. He had evidently just heard the horses and turned around to look. "How, father?" called the Mouser. "It's a good day to be abroad in, and a good home you have here." The peasant considered these statements and then nodded his head in agreement. "We are two weary travelers," continued the Mouser. Again the peasant nodded gravely. "In return for 2 silver coins, will you give us lodging for the night?" The peasant rubbed his chin and then held up 3 fingers. "Very well, you shall have 3 silver coins," said the Mouser, slipping from his horse. Fafhrd followed suit. Only after giving the old man a coin to seal the bargain did the Mouser question casually, "Is there not an old, deserted place near your dwelling called the House of Arganji?" The peasant nodded. "What's it like?" The peasant shrugged his shoulders. "Don't you know?" The peasant shook his head. "But haven't you ever seen the place?" The Mouser's voice carried a note of amazement he did not bother to conceal. He was answered by another headshake. "But father, it's only a few minutes' walk from your dwelling, isn't it?" The peasant nodded tranquilly, as if the whole business were no matter of a surprise. A muscular young man who had come from behind the cottage to take their horses offered a suggestion. "You can see tower from other side the house. I can point her out." At this, the old man proved he was not completely speechless by saying, in a dry, expressionless voice, "Go ahead. Look at her all you want." And he stepped into the cottage. Fafhrd and the Mouser caught a glimpse of a child peering around the door, an old woman stirring a pot, and someone hunched in a big chair before a tiny fire. The upper part of the tower proved to be barely visible through a break in the trees. The last rays of the sun touched it with deep red. It looked about 4 or 5 bow shots distant. And then, even as they watched, the sun dipped under, and it became a featureless square of black stone. "She's an old place," explained the young man vaguely. "I've been all around her. Father, he's just never bothered to look." "You've been inside?" questioned the Mouser. The young man scratched his head. "No. She's just an old place, no good for anything." "There'll be a fairly long twilight," said Fafhrd, his wide green eyes drawn to the tower as if by a lodestone. "Long enough for us to have a closer look." "I'd show the way," said the young man. "Say if I got water to fetch." "No matter," replied Fafhrd. "When supper?" "When the first stars show." They left him holding their horses and walked straight into the woods. Immediately it became much darker, as if twilight were almost over rather than just begun. The vegetation proved to be somewhat thicker than they had anticipated. There were vines and thorns to be avoided. Irregular, pale patches of sky appeared and disappeared overhead. The mouser let Fafard lead the way. His mind was occupied with a queer sort of reverie about the peasants. It tickled his fancy to think how they had stolidly lived their toilsome lives, generation after generation, only a few steps from what might be one of the greatest treasure troves in the world. It seemed incredible. How could people sleep so near jewels and not dream of them? But probably they never dreamed. So the grey mouser was sharply aware of few things during the journey through the woods, save that Fafard seemed to be taking a long time, which was strange, since the barbarian was an accomplished woodsman. Finally, a deeper and more solid shadow loomed up through the trees, and in a moment they were standing in the margin of a small, boulder-studded clearing, most of which was occupied by the bulky structure they sought. Abruptly, even before his eyes took in the details of the place, the mouser's mind was filled with 100 petty perturbations. Weren't they making a mistake in leaving their horses with those strange peasants? And mightn't those rogues have followed them to the cottage? And wasn't this the day of the toad? An unlucky day for entering deserted houses? And shouldn't they have a short spear along, in case they met a leopard? And wasn't that a whippoorwill he heard crying on his left hand? An augury of ill omen? The treasure house of Urgaan of Anganji was a peculiar structure. The main feature was a large, shallow dome resting on walls that formed an octagon. In front and merging into it were two lesser domes. Between these gaped a great square doorway. The tower rose asymmetrically from the rear part of the chief dome. The eyes of the mouser sought hurriedly through the dimming twilight for the cause of the salient peculiarity of the structure, and decided it lay in the utter simplicity. There were no pillars, no outjutting cornices, no friezes, no architectural ornaments of any sort, skull-embellished or otherwise. Save for the doorway and a few tiny windows set in unexpected places, the house of Anganji was a compact mass of uniformly dark grey stones most closely joined. But now Fafard was striding up the short flight of terraced steps that led toward the open door, and the mouser followed him, although he would have liked to spy around a little longer. With every step he took forward, he sensed an odd reluctance growing within him. His earlier mood of pleasant expectancy vanished as suddenly as if he'd stepped into quicksand. It seemed to him that the black doorway yawned like a toothless mouth. And then a little shudder went through him, for he saw the mouth had a tooth, a bit of ghostly white that jutted up from the floor. Fafard was reaching down toward the object. "I wonder whose skull this may be," said the northerner calmly. The mouser regarded the thing and the scattering of bones and fragments of bone beside it. His feeling of uneasiness was fast growing toward a climax, and he had the unpleasant conviction that once it did reach a climax, something would happen. What was the answer to Fafard's question? What form of death had struck down that earlier intruder? It was very dark inside the treasure house. Didn't the manuscript mention something about a guardian? It was hard to think of a flesh-and-blood guardian persisting for 300 years, but there were things that were immortal, or nearly immortal. He could tell that Fafard was not in the least affected by any premonitory disquietude, and was quite capable of instituting an immediate search for the treasure. That must be prevented at all costs. He remembered that the northerner loathed snakes. "This cold, damp stone," he observed casually. "Just the place for scaly, cold-blooded snakes." "Nothing of the sort," replied Fafard angrily. "I'm willing to wager there's not a single serpent inside. Urgan's note said, 'No deadly creature in rocky lair,' and to cap that, 'No serpent, lethal-fanged, yet fair.' I am not thinking of guardian snakes Urga-on may have left here, the mouser explained, but only of serpents that may have wandered in for the night. Just as that skull you hold is not one set there by Urga-on with mortal eye aglare, but merely the brain case of some unfortunate wayfarer who chanced to perish here. I don't know, Fafhrd said, calmly eyeing the skull. Its orbits might glow phosphorescently in absolute dark. A moment later, he was agreeing it would be well to postpone the search until daylight returned, now that the treasure house was located. He carefully replaced the skull. As they re-entered the woods, the mouser heard a little inner voice whispering to him, "Just in time, just in time." Then the sense of uneasiness departed as suddenly as it had come, and he began to feel somewhat ridiculous. This caused him to sing a bawdy ballad of his own invention, wherein demons and other supernatural agents were ridiculed obscenely. Fafhrd chimed in good-naturedly on the choruses. It was not as dark as they expected when they reached the cottage. They saw to their horses, found they had been well cared for, and then fell to the savory mess of beans, porridge, and pot herbs that the peasant's wife ladled into oak bowls. Fresh milk to wash it down was provided in quaintly carved oak goblets. The meal was a satisfying one, and the interior of the house was neat and clean, despite its stamped earthen floor and low beams, which Fafhrd had to duck. There turned out to be 6 in the family, all told. The father, his equally thin and leathery wife, the older son, a young boy, a daughter, and a mumbling grandfather whom extreme age confined to a chair before the fire. The last 2 were the most interesting of the lot. The girl was in the gawkish age of mid-adolescence, but there was a wild, coltish grace in the way she moved her lanky legs and slim arms with their prominent elbows. She was very shy and gave the impression that at any moment she might dart out the door and into the woods. In order to amuse her and win her confidence, the mouser began to perform small feats of legerdemain, plucking copper coins out of the ears of the astonished peasant and bone needles from the nose of his giggling wife. He turned beans into buttons and back again into beans, swallowed a large fork, made a tiny wooden mannequin jig on the palm of his hand, and utterly bewildered the cat by pulling what seemed to be a mouse out of its mouth. The old folks gaped and grinned. The little boy became frantic with excitement. His sister watched everything with concentrated interest and even smiled warmly when the mouser presented her with a square of fine green linen he had conjured from the air, although she was still too shy to speak. Then Fafhrd roared sea chanties that rocked the roof and sang lusty songs that set the old grandfather gurgling with delight. Meanwhile the mouser fetched a small wineskin from his saddlebags, concealed it under his cloak, and filled the oak goblets as if by magic. These rapidly fuddled the peasants, who were unused to so potent a beverage, and by the time Fafhrd had finished telling a blood-curdling tale of the frozen north, they were all nodding, save the girl and the grandfather. The latter looked up at the merry-making adventurers, his watery eyes filled with a kind of impish, senile glee, and mumbled, "You two be right clever men. Maybe you be beast dodgers." But before this remark could be elucidated, his eyes had gone vacant again, and in a few moments he was snoring. Soon all were asleep, Fafhrd and the mouser keeping their weapons close at hand, but only variegated snores and occasional snaps from the dying embers disturbed the silence of the cottage. The day of the cat dawned clear and cool. The mouser stretched himself luxuriously and, cat-like, flexed his muscles and sucked in the sweet, dewy air. He felt exceptionally cheerful and eager to be up and doing. Was not this his day, the day of the grey mouser, a day in which luck could not fail him? His slight movements awakened Fafhrd, and together they stole silently from the cottage so as not to disturb the peasants, who were oversleeping with the wine they had taken. They refreshed their faces and hands in the wet grass and visited their horses. Then they munched some bread, washed it down with draughts of cool well water, flavored with wine, and made ready to depart. This time their preparations were well thought out. The mouser carried a mallet and a stout iron pry-bar in case they had to attack masonry, and made certain that candles, flint, wedges, chisels, and several other small tools were in his pouch. Fafford borrowed a pick from the peasant's implements and tucked a coil of thin, strong rope in his belt. He also took his bow and quiver of arrows. The forest was delightful at this early hour. Bird cries and chatterings came from overhead, and once they glimpsed a black squirrel-like animal scampering along a bough. A couple of chipmunks scurried under a bush dotted with red berries. What had been shadow the evening before was now a variety of green-leafed beauty. The two adventurers trod softly. They had hardly gone more than a bowshot into the woods when they heard a faint rustling behind them. The rustling came rapidly nearer, and suddenly the peasant girl burst into view. She stood breathless and poised, one hand touching a tree trunk, the other pressing some leaves, ready to fly away at the first sudden move. Fafford and the mouser stood as stock-still as if she were a doe or a dryad. Finally, she managed to conquer her shyness and speak. "You go there?" she questioned, indicating the direction of the treasure house with a quick ducking nod. Her dark eyes were serious. "Yes, we go there," answered Fafford, smiling. "Don't." This word was accompanied by a rapid headshake. "But why shouldn't we, girl?" Fafford's voice was gentle and sonorous, like an integral part of the forest. It seemed to touch some spring within the girl that enabled her to feel more at ease. She gulped a big breath and began. "Because I watch it from edge of the forest, but never go close. Never, never, never. I say to myself, there be a magic circle I must not cross. And I say to myself, there be a giant inside, queer and fearsome giant." Her words were coming rapidly now, like an undammed stream. "All gray he be, like the stone of his house, all gray, eyes and hair and fingernails too, and he has a stone club as big as a tree, and he be big, bigger than you, twice as big." Here she nodded at Fafford. "And with his club he kills, but only if you go close. Every day almost I play a game with him. I pretend to be going to cross the magic circle, and he watches from inside the door where I can't see him, and he thinks I'm going to cross. And I dance through the forest all around the house, and he follows me, peering from the little windows. And I get closer and closer to the circle, closer and closer, but I never cross. And he be very angry and gnash his teeth like rocks rubbing rocks so that the house shakes, and I run away. But you mustn't go inside. Oh, you mustn't." She paused, as if startled by her own daring. Her eyes were fixed anxiously on Fafford. She seemed drawn toward him. The northerner's reply carried no overtone of patronizing laughter. "But you've never actually seen the great giant, have you?" "Oh, no, he be too cunning. But I say to myself, he must be there inside. I know he be inside. And that's the same thing, isn't it? Grandfather knows about him. We used to talk about him when I was little. Grandfather calls him the beast. But the others laugh at me, so I don't tell." Here was another astounding peasant paradox, thought the mouser with an inward grin. Imagination was such a rare commodity with them that this girl unhesitatingly took it for reality. "Don't worry about us, girl. We'll be on the watch for your great giant," he started to say, but he had less success than Fafford in keeping his voice completely natural, or else the cadence of his words didn't chime so well with the forest setting. The girl uttered one more warning. "Don't go inside, oh, please," and turned and darted away. The two adventurers looked at each other and smiled. Somehow the unexpected fairy tale, with its conventional ogre and its charmingly naive narrator, added to the delight of the dewy morning. Without a comment, they resumed their soft-stepping progress. And it was well that they went quietly, for when they had gotten within a stone's throw of the clearing, they heard low voices that seemed to be in grumbling argument. Immediately they cached the pick and pry bar and mallet under a clump of bushes and stole forward, taking advantage of the natural cover and watching where they planted their feet. On the edge of the clearing stood half a dozen stocky men in black chainmail shirts, bows on their backs, short swords at their sides. They were immediately recognizable as the rogues who had laid the ambuscade. 2 of them started for the treasure house, only to be recalled by a comrade, whereupon the argument apparently started afresh. "That red-haired one," whispered the mouser after an unhurried look. "I can swear I've seen him in the stables of Lord Ranache." My guess was right. It seems we have a rival. "Why do they wait and keep pointing at the house?" whispered Farfod. "Is it because some of their comrades are already at work inside?" The mouser shook his head. "That cannot be. See those picks and shovels and levers they have rested on the ground? Now, they wait for someone, for a leader. Some of them want to examine the house before he arrives. Others counsel against it. And I will bet my head against a bowling ball that the leader is Ranache himself. He is much too greedy and suspicious to entrust a treasure quest to any henchman." "What's to do?" murmured Farfod. "We cannot enter the house unseen, even if it were the wise course, which it isn't. Once in, we'd be trapped." "I'd have a mind to loose my sling at them right now and teach them something about the art of ambuscade," replied the mouser, slitting his eyes grimly. "Only then the survivors would flee into the house and hold us off until, mayhap, Ranache came and more men with him." "We might circle part way around the clearing," said Farfod after a moment's pause. "Keeping to the woods. Then we can enter the clearing unseen and shelter ourselves behind one of the small domes. And that way we become masters of the doorway and can prevent their taking cover inside. Thereafter I will address them suddenly and try to frighten them off. You meanwhile staying hid and giving substance to my threats by making enough racket for 10 men. This seemed to be the handiest plan to both of them, and they managed the first part of it without a hitch. The mouser crouched behind the small dome, his sword sling, daggers, and a couple of sticks of wood laid ready for either noise-making or fight. Then Farfod strode briskly forward, his bow held carelessly in front of him, an arrow fitted to the string. It was done so casually that it was a few moments before Ranache's henchmen noticed him. Then they quickly reached for their own bows, and as quickly desisted when they saw that the huge newcomer had the advantage of them. They scowled in irritated perplexity. "Ho, rogues!" began Farfod. "We allow you just as much time as it will take you to make yourself scarce, and no more. Don't think to resist or come skulking back. My men are scattered through the woods. At a sign from me, they will feather you with arrows." Meanwhile, the mouser had begun a low din, and was slowly and artistically working it up in volume. Rapidly varying the pitch and intonation of his voice, and making it echo first from some part of the building and then from the forest wall, he created the illusion of a squad of bloodthirsty bowmen. Nasty cries of, "Shall we let fly? You take the redhead," and "Try for the belly shot, it's surest," kept coming now from one point and now another, until it was all Farfod could do to refrain from laughing at the woebegone, startled glances the 6 rogues kept darting around. But his merriment was extinguished when, just as the rogues were starting to slink shamefacedly away, an arrow arched erratically out of the woods, passing a spear's length above his head. "Curse that branch!" came a deep guttural voice the mouser recognized as issuing from the throat of Lord Ranache. Immediately after, it began to bark commands. At them, you fools. It's all a trick. There are only the two of them. Rush them. Fafhrd turned without warning and loosed point blank at the voice, but did not silence it. Then he dodged back behind the small dome and ran with the mouser for the woods. The 6 rogues, wisely deciding that a charge with drawn swords would be overly heroic, followed suit, unslinging their bows as they went. One of them turned before he had reached sufficient cover, knocking an arrow. It was a mistake. A ball from the mouser's sling took him low on the forehead, and he toppled forward and was still. The sound of that hit and fall was the last heard in the clearing for quite a long time, save for the inevitable bird cries, some of which were genuine and some of which were communications between Fafhrd and the mouser. The conditions of the death-dealing contest were obvious. Once it had fairly begun, no one dared enter the clearing, since he would become a fatally easy mark. And the mouser was sure that none of the 5 remaining rogues had taken shelter in the treasure house. Nor did either side dare withdraw all its men out of sight of the doorway, since that would allow someone to take a commanding position in the top of the tower, providing the tower had a negotiable stair. Therefore, it was a case of sneaking about near the edge of the clearing, circling and counter-circling, with a great deal of squatting in a good place and waiting for somebody to come along and be shot. The mouser and Fafhrd began by adopting the latter strategy, first moving about 20 paces nearer the point at which the rogues had disappeared. Evidently, their patience was a little better than that of their opponents. For after about 10 minutes of nerve-wracking waiting, during which pointed seed pods had a queer way of looking like arrowheads, Fafhrd got the red-haired henchman full in the throat, just as he was bending his bow for a shot at the mouser. That left 4 besides Ranosh himself. Immediately, the 2 adventurers changed their tactics and separated, the mouser circling rapidly around the treasure house, and Fafhrd drawing as far back from the open space as he dared. Ranosh's men must have decided on the same plan, for the mouser almost bumped into a scar-faced rogue as soft-footed as himself. At such close range, bow and sling were both useless in their normal function. Scarface attempted to jab the barbed arrow he held into the mouser's eye. The mouser weaved his body to one side, swung his sling like a whip, and felled the man senseless with a blow from the horn handle. Then he retreated a few paces, thanked the Day of the Cat that there had not been 2 of them, and took to the trees as being a safer, though slower method of progress. Keeping to the middle heights, he scurried along with the sure-footedness of a rope-walker, swinging from branch to branch only when it was necessary, making sure he always had more than one way of retreat open. He had completed 3/4 of his circuit when he heard the clash of swords a few trees ahead. He increased his speed and was soon looking down on a sweet little combat. Fafhrd, his back to a great oak, had his broadsword out and was holding off 2 of Ranosh's henchmen, who were attacking with their shorter weapons. It was a tight spot, and the northerner realized it. He knew that ancient sagas told of heroes who could best 4 or more men at swordplay. He also knew that such sagas were lies, providing the hero's opponents were reasonably competent. And Ranosh's men were veterans. They attacked cautiously but incessantly, keeping their swords well in front of them and never slashing wildly. Their breath whistled through their nostrils, but they were grimly confident, knowing the northerner dared not lunge strongly at one of them because it would lay him wide open to a thrust by the other. Their game was to get one on each side of him and then attack simultaneously. Fafhrd's counter was to shift position quickly and attack the nearer one murderously before the other could get back in range. In that way, he managed to keep them side by side, where he could hold their blades in check by swift feints and crosswise sweeps. Sweat beaded his face, and blood dripped from a scratch on his left thigh. A fearsome grin showed his white teeth, which occasionally parted to let slip a base, primitive insult. The mouser took in the situation at a glance, descended rapidly to a lower bough, and poised himself, aiming a dagger at the back of one of Fafard's adversaries. He was, however, standing very close to the thick trunk, and around this trunk darted a horny hand, tipped with a short sword. The third henchman had also thought it wise to take to the trees. Fortunately for the mouser, the man was uncertain of his footing, and therefore his thrust, although well aimed, came a shade slow. As it was, the little gray-clad man only managed to dodge by dropping off. Thereupon he startled his opponent with a modest acrobatic feat. He did not drop to the ground, knowing that would put everyone at the mercy of the man in the tree. Instead, he grabbed hold of the branch on which he had been standing, swung himself smartly up again, and grappled. Steadying themselves now with one hand, now another, they drove for each other's throats, ramming with knees and elbows whenever they got the chance. At the first onset, both dagger and sword were dropped, the latter sticking point down in the ground directly between the two battling henchmen, and startling them so that Fafard almost got home an attack. The mouser and his man surged and teetered along the branch away from the trunk, inflicting little damage on each other, since it was hard to keep balance. Finally, they slid off at the same time, but grabbed the branch with their hands. The puffing henchman aimed a vicious kick. The mouser escaped it by yanking up his body and doubling up his legs. The latter he let fly violently, taking the henchman full in the chest, just where the ribs stop. The unfortunate retainer of Ranash fell to the ground, where he had the wind knocked out of him a second time. At the same moment, one of Fafard's opponents tried a trick that might have turned out well. When his companion was pressing the northerner closely, he snatched for the short sword sticking in the ground, intending to hurl it underhanded as if it were a javelin. But Fafard, whose superior endurance was rapidly giving him an advantage in speed, anticipated the movement and simultaneously made a brilliant counterattack against the other man. There were two thrusts, both lightning-like, the first a feint at the belly, the second a slicing stab that sheared through the throat to the spine. Then he whirled around and, with a quick sweep, knocked both weapons out of the hands of the first man, who looked up in bewilderment and promptly collapsed into a sitting position, panting in utter exhaustion, though with enough breath left to cry, "Mercy!" To cap the situation, the mouser dropped lightly down, as if out of the sky. Fafard automatically started to raise his sword for a backhand swipe. Then he stared at the mouser for as long a time as it took the man sitting on the ground to give 3 tremendous gasps. Then he began to laugh. First, uncontrollable snickers, and later thundering peals. It was a laughter in which the battle-begotten madness, completely sated anger, and relief at escape from death were equally mingled. "Oh, by Glaggard and by Goss!" he roared. "By the behemoth! Oh, by the cold waste and the guts of the Red God! Ho, ho, ho!" Again the insane bellowing burst out. "Oh, by the killer whale and the cold woman and her spawn!" By degrees, the laughter died away, choking in his throat. He rubbed his forehead with the palm of his hand, and his face became starkly grave. Then he knelt beside the man he had just slain, and straightened his limbs, and closed his eyes, and began to weep, in a dignified way that would have seemed ridiculous and hypocritical in anyone but a barbarian. Meanwhile, the mouse's reactions were nowhere near as primitive. He felt worried, ironic, and slightly sick. He understood Fafard's emotions, but knew that he would not feel the full force of his own for some time yet, and by then they would be deadened and somewhat choked. He peered about anxiously, fearful of an anticlimactic attack that would find his companion helpless. He counted over the tally of their opponents. Yes, the 6 henchmen were all accounted for, but Ranash himself. Where was Ranash? He fumbled in his pouch to make sure he had not lost his good-luck talismans and amulets. His lips moved rapidly as he murmured 2 or 3 prayers and cantrips. But all the while he held his sling ready, and his eyes never once ceased their quick shifting. From the middle of a thick clump of bushes, he heard a series of agonized gasps as the man he had felled from the tree began to regain his wind. The henchman whom Fafod had disarmed, his face ashy pale from exhaustion rather than fright, was slowly edging back into the forest. The mouser watched him carelessly, noting the comical way in which the steel cap had slipped down over his forehead and rested against the bridge of his nose. Meanwhile, the gasps of the man in the bushes were taking on a less agonized quality. At almost the same instant, the two rose to their feet and stumbled off into the forest. The mouser listened to their blundering retreat. He was sure that there was nothing more to fear from them. They wouldn't come back. And then a little smile stole into his face, for he heard the sounds of a third person joining them in their flight. That would be Ranash, thought the mouser, a man cowardly at heart and incapable of carrying on single-handed. It did not occur to him that the third person might be the man he had stunned with a sling handle. Mostly, just to be doing something, he followed them leisurely for a couple of bow shots into the forest. Their trail was impossible to miss, being marked by trampled bushes and thorns bearing tatters of cloth. It led in a beeline away from the clearing. Satisfied, he returned, going out of his way to regain the mallet, pick, and pry bar. He found Fafod tying a loose bandage around the scratch on his thigh. The northerner's emotions had run their gamut, and he was himself again. The dead man, for whom he had been somberly grieving now, meant no more to him than food for beetles and birds. Whereas for the mouser, it continued to be a somewhat frightening and sickening object. "And now, do we proceed with our interrupted business?" the mouser asked. Fafod nodded in a matter-of-fact manner and rose to his feet. Together, they entered the rocky clearing. It came to them as a surprise how little time the fight had taken. True, the sun had moved somewhat higher, but the atmosphere was still that of early morning. The dew had not dried yet. The treasure house of Urga-an of Anganji stood massive, featureless, grotesquely impressive. "The peasant girl predicted the truth without knowing it," said the mouser with a smile. "We played her game of circle the clearing and don't cross the magic circle, didn't we?" The treasure house had no fears for him today. He recalled his perturbations of the previous evening, but was unable to understand them. The very idea of a guardian seemed somewhat ridiculous. There were 100 other ways of explaining the skeleton inside the doorway. So this time, it was the mouser who skipped into the treasure house ahead of Fafod. The interior was disappointing, being empty of any furnishings and as bare and unornamented as the outside walls. Just a large, low room. To either side, square doorways led to the smaller domes, while to the rear, a long hallway was dimly apparent, and the beginnings of a stair leading to the upper part of the main dome. With only a casual glance at the skull and the broken skeleton, the mouser made his way toward the stair. "Our document," he said to Fafod, who was now beside him, "speaks of the treasure as resting just below the keystone of the chief dome. Therefore, we must seek in the room or rooms above." "True," answered the northerner, glancing around. "But I wonder, mouser, just what use the structure served. A man who builds a house solely to hide a treasure is shouting to the world that he has a treasure. Do you think it might have been a temple?" The mouser suddenly shrank back with a sibilant exclamation. Sprawled a little way up the stair was another skeleton, the major bones hanging together in lifelike fashion. The whole upper half of the skull was smashed to bony shards, paler than those of a grey pot. "Our hosts are overly ancient and indecently naked," hissed the mouser, angry with himself for being startled. Then he darted up the stairs to examine the grisly find. His sharp eyes picked out several objects among the bones: a rusty dagger, a tarnished gold ring that looped a knuckle bone, a handful of horn buttons, and a slim, green-eaten copper cylinder. The last awakened his curiosity. He picked it up, dislodging hand bones in the process, so that they fell apart, rattling dryly. He pried off the cap of the cylinder with his dagger point and shook out a tightly rolled sheet of ancient parchment. This he gingerly unwound. Fafford and he scanned the lines of diminutive red lettering by the light from a small window on the landing above. "Mine is a secret treasure. Orichalcum have I, and crystal and blood-red amber. Rubies and emeralds that demons would war for, and a diamond as big as the skull of a man. Yet none have seen them save I, Urga-an of Anganji, scorn the flattery and the envy of fools. A fittingly lonely treasure house have I built for my jewels. There, hidden under the keystone, they may dream unperturbed until earth and sky wear away. A day's ride beyond the village of Soriv, in the valley of the two double-humped hills, lies that house, trebly domed and single-towered. It is empty. Any fool may enter. Let him. I care not." "The details differ slightly," murmured the mouser, "but the phrases have the same ring as in our document." "The man must have been mad," asserted Fafford, scowling. "Or else why should he carefully hide a treasure and then, with equal care, leave directions for finding it?" "We thought our document was a memorandum, or an oversight," said the mouser thoughtfully. "Such a notion can hardly explain two documents." Lost in speculation, he turned toward the remaining section of the stair, only to find still another skull grinning at him from a shadowy angle. This time he was not startled, yet he experienced the same feeling that a fly must experience when, enmeshed in a spider's web, it sees the dangling, empty corpses of a dozen of its brothers. He began to speak rapidly. Nor can such a notion explain 3 or 4 or mayhap a dozen such documents, for how came these other questers here unless each had found a written message? Urga-an of Anganji may have been mad, but he sought deliberately to lure men here. One thing is certain. This house conceals, or did conceal, some deadly trap. Some guardian. Some giant beast, say. Or perhaps the very stones distill a poison. Perhaps hidden springs release sword blades which stab out through cracks in the walls and then return. "That cannot be," answered Fafford. "These men were killed by great bashing blows. The ribs and spine of the first were splintered. The second had his skull cracked open. And that third one there, see? The bones of his lower body are smashed." The mouser started to reply. Then his face broke into an unexpected smile. He could see the conclusion to which Fafford's arguments were unconsciously leading, and he knew that that conclusion was ridiculous. What thing would kill with great bashing blows? What thing but the grey giant the peasant girl had told them about? The grey giant, twice as tall as a man, with his great stone club. A giant fit only for fairy tales and fantasies. And Fafford returned the mouser's smile. It seemed to him that they were making a great deal of fuss about nothing. These skeletons were suggestive enough, to be sure, but did they not represent men who had died many, many years ago, centuries ago? What guardian could outlast 3 centuries? Why, that was a long enough time to weary the patience of a demon. And there were no such things as demons anyhow. And there was no earthly use in mucking around about ancient fears and horrors that were as dead as dust. The whole matter, thought Fafford, boiled down to something very simple. They had come to a deserted house to see if there was a treasure in it. Agreed upon this point, the 2 comrades made their way up the remaining section of stair that led to the dimmer regions of the house of Anganji. Despite their confidence, they moved cautiously, and kept sharp watch on the shadows laying ahead. This was wise. Just as they reached the top, a flash of steel spun out of the darkness. It nicked the mouser in the shoulder as he twisted to one side. There was a metallic clash as it fell to the stone floor. The mouser, gripped by a sudden spasm of anger and fright, ducked down and dashed rapidly through the door from which the weapon had come, straight at the danger, whatever it was. "Dagger tossing in the dark, eh, you slick-bellied worm?" Fafhrd heard the mouser cry, and then he too had plunged through the door. Lord Ranash cowered against the wall, his rich hunting garb dusty and disordered, his black wavy hair pushed back from his forehead, his cruelly handsome face a sallow mask of hate and extreme terror. For the moment the latter emotion seemed to predominate, and, oddly enough, it did not appear to be directed toward the men he had just assailed, but toward something else, something unapparent. "Oh, gods!" he cried. "Let me go from here. The treasure's yours. Let me out of this place, else I am doomed. The thing has played at cat and mouse with me. I cannot bear it. I cannot bear it!" "So now we pipe a different tune, do we?" snarled the mouser. "First dagger-tossing, then fright and please." "Filthy coward tricks," added Fafhrd. "Skulking here safe while your henchman died bravely." "Safe? Safe, you say? Oh, gods!" Ranash almost screamed. Then a subtle change became apparent in his rigid, muscled face. It was not that his terror decreased. If anything, that became greater. But there was added to it, over and above, a consciousness of desperate shame, a realization that he had demeaned himself ineradicably in the eyes of these two ruffians. His lips began to writhe, showing tight-clenched teeth. He extended his left hand in a gesture of supplication. "Oh, mercy, have mercy!" he cried piteously, and his right hand twitched a second dagger from his belt and hurled it underhand at Fafhrd. The northerner knocked aside the weapon with a swift blow of his palm, then said deliberately, "He is yours, Mouser. Kill the man." And now it was cat against cornered rat. Lord Ranash whipped a gleaming sword from its gold-worked scabbard and rushed in, cutting, thrusting, stabbing. The mouser gave ground slightly, his slim blade flickering in a defensive counterattack that was wavering and elusive, yet deadly. He brought Ranash's rush to a standstill. His blade moved so quickly that it seemed to weave a net of steel around the man. Then it leaped forward 3 times in rapid succession. At the first thrust, it bent nearly double against a concealed shirt of chainmail. The second thrust pierced the belly. The third transfixed the throat. Lord Ranash fell to the floor, spitting and gagging, his fingers clawing at his neck. There he died. "An evil end," said Fafhrd somberly, though he had fairer play than he deserved, and handled his sword well. "Mouser, I like not this killing, although there was surely more justice to it than the others." The mouser, wiping his weapon against his opponent's thigh, understood what Fafhrd meant. He felt no elation at his victory, only a cold, queasy disgust. A moment before he had been raging, but now there was no anger left in him. He pulled open his grey jerkin and inspected the dagger wound in his left shoulder. A little blood was still welling from it and trickling down his arm. Lord Ranash was no coward, he said slowly. He killed himself, or at least caused his own death, because we had seen him terrified and heard him cry in fright. And at these words, without any warning whatsoever, stark terror fell like an icy eclipse upon the hearts of the grey mouser and Fafhrd. It was as if Lord Ranash had left them a legacy of fear, which passed to them immediately upon his death. And the unmanning thing about it was that they had no premonitory apprehension, no hint of its approach. It did not take root and grow gradually greater. It came all at once, paralyzing, overwhelming. Worse still, there was no discernible cause. One moment they were looking down with something of indifference upon the twisted corpse of Lord Ranash. The next moment their legs were weak, their guts were cold, their spines prickling, their teeth clicking, their hearts pounding, their hair lifting at the roots. Fafford felt as if he had walked unsuspecting into the jaws of a gigantic serpent. His barbaric mind was stirred to the deeps. He thought of the grim god Kos brooding alone in the icy silence of the cold waste. He thought of the masked powers fate and chance, and of the game they play for the blood and brains of men. And he did not will these thoughts. Rather did the freezing fear seem to crystallize them, so that they dropped into his consciousness like snowflakes. Slowly, he regained control over his quaking limbs and twitching muscles. As if in a nightmare, he looked around him slowly, taking in the details of his surroundings. The room they were in was semicircular, forming half of the great dome. 2 small windows high in the curving ceiling let in light. An inner voice kept repeating, "Don't make a sudden move. Slowly, slowly. Above all, don't run. The others did. That was why they died so quickly. Slowly, slowly." He saw the mouse's face. It reflected his own terror. He wondered how much longer this would last, how much longer he could stand it without running amok, how much longer he could passively endure this feeling of a great invisible paw reaching out over him, span by span, implacably. The faint sound of footsteps came from the room below. Regular and unhurried footsteps. Now they were crossing into the rear hallway below. Now they were on the stairs, and now they had reached the landing and were advancing up the second section of the stairs. The man who entered the room was tall and frail and old and very gaunt. Scant locks of intensely black hair straggled down over his high-domed forehead. His sunken cheeks showed clearly the outlines of his long jawbone, and waxy skin was pulled tight over his small nose. Fanatical eyes burned in deep, bony sockets. He wore the simple, sleeveless robe of a holy man. A pouch hung from the cord round his waist. He fixed his eyes upon Fafford and the Grey Mouser. "I greet you, you men of blood," he said in a hollow voice. Then his gaze fell with displeasure upon the corpse of Ranash. "More blood has been shed. It is not well." And with the bony forefinger of his left hand he traced in the air a curious triple square, the sign sacred to the great god. "Do not speak," his calm, toneless voice continued, "for I know your purposes. You have come to take treasure from this house. Others have sought to do the same. They have failed. You will fail. As for myself, I have no lust for treasure. For 40 years I have lived on crusts and water, devoting my spirit to the great God." Again he traced the curious sign. "The gems and ornaments of this world and the jewels and golds of the world of demons cannot tempt or corrupt me. My purpose in coming here is to destroy an evil thing. And here he touched his chest. "I am Arvlan of Anganji, the 9th lineal descendant of Urgaan of Anganji. This I always knew and sorrowed for, because Urgaan of Anganji was a man of evil. But not until 15 days ago, on the day of the spider, did I discover from ancient documents that Urgaan had built this house, and built it to be an eternal trap for the unwise and venturesome. He has left a guardian here, and that guardian has endured. Cunning was my accursed ancestor Urgaan, cunning and evil. The most skillful architect in all Lankhmar was Urgaan, a man wise in the ways of stone and learned in geometrical lore. But he scorned the great god. He longed for improper powers. He had commerce with demons, and won from them an unnatural treasure, but he had no use for it. For in seeking wealth and knowledge and power, he lost his ability to enjoy any good feeling or pleasure, even simple lust. So he hid his treasure, but hid it in such a way that it would wreak endless evil on the world, even as he felt men and one proud, contemptuous, cruel woman, as heartless as this Fane, had wreaked evil upon him. It is my purpose and my right to destroy Urga-An's evil. Seek not to dissuade me, lest doom fall upon you. As for me, no harm can befall me. The hand of the great God is poised above me, ready to ward off any danger that may threaten his faithful servant. His will is my will. Do not speak, men of blood. I go to destroy the treasure of Urga-An of Angarnji. And with these words, the gaunt holy man walked calmly on, with measured stride, like an apparition, and disappeared through the narrow doorway that led into the forward part of the great dome. Fafhrd stared after him, his green eyes wide, feeling no desire to follow or to interfere. His terror had not left him, but it was transmuted. He was still aware of a dreadful threat, but it no longer seemed to be directed against him personally. Meanwhile, a most curious notion had lodged in the mind of the Mouser. He felt that he had just now seen not a venerable holy man, but a dim reflection of the centuries-dead Urga-An of Angarnji. Surely Urga-An had that same high-domed forehead, that same secret pride, that same air of command. And those locks of youthfully black hair, which contrasted so ill with the aged face, also seemed part of a picture looming from the past, a picture dimmed and distorted by time, but retaining something of the power and individuality of the ancient original. They heard the footsteps of the holy man proceed a little way into the other room. Then, for the space of a dozen heartbeats, there was complete silence. Then the floor began to tremble slightly under their feet, as if the earth were quaking, or as if a giant were treading near. Then there came a single quavering cry from the next room, cut off in the middle by a single sickening crash that made them lurch. Then once again, utter silence. Fafhrd and the Mouser looked at one another in blank amazement, not so much because of what they had just heard, but because, almost at the moment of the crash, the pall of terror had lifted from them completely. They jerked out their swords and hurried into the next room. It was a duplicate of the one they had quitted, save that instead of 2 small windows, there were 3, one of them near the floor. Also, there was but a single door, the one through which they had just entered. All else was closely mortised stone, floor, walls, and hemi-domed ceiling. Near the thick center wall, which bisected the dome, lay the body of the holy man, only lay was not the right word. Left shoulder and chest were mashed against the floor. Life was fled. Blood puddled around. Fafhrd and the Mouser's eyes searched wildly for a being other than themselves in the dead man, and found none. No, not one gnat hovering amongst the dust motes revealed by the narrow shafts of sunlight shooting down through the windows. Their imaginations searched as wildly, and as much in vain, for a being that could strike such a man-killing blow and vanish through one of the 3 tiny orifices of the windows. A giant striking serpent with a granite head. Set in the wall near the dead man was a stone about 2 feet square, jutting out a little from the rest. On this was boldly engraved, in antique Lankhmarian hieroglyphs, "Here rests the treasure of Urga-An of Angarnji." The sight of that stone was like a blow in the face to the 2 adventurers. It roused every ounce of obstinacy and reckless determination in them. What matter that an old man sprawled smashed beside it? They had their swords. What matter they now had proof some grim guardian resided in the treasure house? They could take care of themselves. Run away and leave that stone unmoved with its insultingly provocative inscription? No, by Kos and the Behemoth. They'd see themselves in Nerwan's hell first. Fafhrd ran to fetch the pick and the other large tools, which had been dropped on the stairs when Lord Ranarsh tossed his first dagger. The mouser looked more closely at the jutting stone. The cracks around it were wide and filled with a dark, tarry mixture. It gave out a slightly hollow sound when he tapped it with his sword hilt. He had calculated that the wall was about 6 feet thick at this point, enough to contain a sizable cavity. He tapped experimentally along the wall in both directions, but the hollow ring quickly ceased. Evidently, the cavity was a fairly small one. He noted that the crevices between all the other stones were very fine, showing no evidence of any cementing substance whatsoever. In fact, he couldn't be sure that they weren't false crevices, superficial cuts in the surface of solid rock. But that hardly seemed possible. He heard Fafhrd returning, but continued his examination. The state of the mouser's mind was peculiar. A dogged determination to get at the treasure overshadowed other emotions. The inexplicably sudden vanishing of his former terror had left certain parts of his mind benumbed. It was as if he had decided to hold his thoughts in leash until he had seen what the treasure cavity contained. He was content to keep his mind occupied with material details and yet make no deductions from them. His calmness gave him a feeling of at least temporary safety. His experiences had vaguely convinced him that the guardian, whatever it was, which had smashed the holy man and played cat and mouse with Ranarsh and themselves, did not strike without first inspiring a premonitory terror in its victims. Fafhrd felt very much the same way, except that he was even more single-minded in his determination to solve the riddle of the inscribed stone. They attacked the wide crevices with chisel and mallet. The dark tarry mixture came away fairly easily, first in hard lumps, later in slightly rubbery, gouged strips. After they had cleared it away to the depth of a finger, Fafhrd inserted the pick and managed to move the stone slightly. Thus the mouser was enabled to gouge a little more deeply on that side. Then Fafhrd subjected the other side of the stone to the leverage of the pick. So the work proceeded, with alternate pryings and gougings. They concentrated on each detail of the job with unnecessary intensity, mainly to keep their imaginations from being haunted by the image of a man more than 200 years dead. A man with high-domed forehead, sunken cheeks, nose of a skull, that is, if the dead thing on the floor was a true type of the breed of Anganji. A man who had somehow won a great treasure and then hid it away from all eyes, seeking to obtain neither glory nor material profit from it, who said he scorned the envy of fools, and who yet wrote many provocative notes in diminutive red lettering in order to inform fools of his treasure and make them envious, who seemed to be reaching out across the dusty centuries like a spider spinning a web to catch a fly on the other side of the world. And yet, he was a skillful architect, the holy man had said. Could such an architect build a stone automaton twice as tall as a tall man? A gray stone automaton with a great club? Could he make a hiding place from which it could emerge, deal death, and then return? No. No, such notions were childish, not to be entertained. Stick to the job in hand. First find what lay behind the inscribed stone. Leave thoughts until afterward. The stone was beginning to give more easily to the pressure of the pick. Soon they would be able to get a good purchase on it and pry it out. Meanwhile, an entirely new sensation was growing in the mouser. Not one of terror at all, but of physical revulsion. The air he breathed seemed thick and sickening. He found himself disliking the texture and consistency of the tarry mixture gouged from the cracks, which somehow he could only liken to wholly imaginary substances, such as the dung of dragons or the solidified vomit of the behemoth. He avoided touching it with his fingers, and he kicked away the litter of chunks and strips that had gathered around his feet. The sensation of queasy loathing became difficult to endure. He tried to fight it, but had no more success than if it had been seasickness, which in some ways it resembled. He felt unpleasantly dizzy. His mouth kept filling with saliva. The cold sweat of nausea beaded his forehead. He could tell that Farfod was unaffected, and he hesitated to mention the matter. It seemed ridiculously out of place, especially as it was unaccompanied by any fear or fright. Finally, the stone itself began to have the same effect on him as the tarry mixture, filling him with a seemingly causeless, but nonetheless sickening revulsion. Then he could bear it no longer. With a vaguely apologetic nod to Farfod, he dropped his chisel and went to the low window for a breath of fresh air. This did not seem to help matters much. He pushed his head through the window and gulped deeply. His mental processes were overshadowed by the general indifference of extreme nausea, and everything seemed very far away. Therefore, when he saw that the peasant girl was standing in the middle of the clearing, it was some time before he began to consider the import of the fact. When he did, part of his sickness left him, or at least he was enabled to overpower it sufficiently to stare at her with gathering interest. Her face was white, her fists were clenched, her arms held rigid at her sides. Even at the distance, he could catch something of the mingled terror and determination with which her eyes were fixed on the great doorway. Toward this doorway she was forcing herself to move, one jerking step after another, as if she had to keep screwing her courage to a higher pitch. Suddenly the mouser began to feel frightened, not for himself at all, but for the girl. Her terror was obviously intense, and yet she must be doing what she was doing, braving her queer and fearsome grey giant, for his sake and Farfod's. At all costs, he thought. She must be prevented from coming closer. It was wrong that she be subjected for one moment longer to such a horribly intense terror. His mind was confused by his abominable nausea, yet he knew what he must do. He hurried toward the stairs with shaky strides, waving Farfod another vague gesture. Just as he was going out of the room, he chanced to turn up his eyes and spied something peculiar on the ceiling. What it was, he did not fully realize for some moments. Farfod hardly noticed the mouse's movements, much less his gestures. The block of stone was rapidly yielding to his efforts. He had previously experienced a faint suggestion of the mouse's nausea, but perhaps because of his greater single-mindedness, it had not become seriously bothersome. And now his attention was wholly concentrated on the stone. Persistent prying had edged it out a palm's breadth from the wall. Seizing it firmly in his two powerful hands, he tugged it from one side to the other, back and forth. The dark, viscous stuff clung to it tenaciously, but with each sidewise jerk it moved forward a little. The mouser lurched hastily down the stairs, fighting vertigo. His feet kicked bones and sent them knocking against the walls. What was it he had seen on the ceiling? Somehow it seemed to mean something. But he must get the girl out of the clearing. She mustn't come any closer to the house. She mustn't enter. Farfod began to feel the weight of the stone and knew that it was nearly clear. It was damnably heavy, almost a foot thick. 2 carefully gauged heaves finished the job. The stone overbalanced. He stepped quickly back. The stone crashed ponderously on the floor. A rainbow glitter came from the cavity that had been revealed. Farfod eagerly thrust his head into it. The mouser staggered toward the doorway. It was a bloody smear he had seen on the ceiling, and just above the corpse of the holy man. But why should that be? He'd been smashed against the floor, hadn't he? Was it blood splashed up from his lethal clubbing? But then why smeared? No matter. The girl. He must get to the girl. He must. There she was, almost at the doorway. He could see her. He felt the stone floor vibrating slightly beneath his feet. But that was his dizziness, wasn't it? Pfafford felt the vibration too. But any thought he might have had about it was lost in his wonder at what he saw. The cavity was filled to a level just below the surface of the opening with a heavy metallic liquid that resembled mercury, except that it was night black. Resting on this liquid was a more astonishing group of gems than Pfafford had ever dreamed of. In the center was a Titan diamond, cut with a myriad of oddly angled facets. Around it were 2 irregular circles, the inner formed of 12 rubies, each a decahedron, the outer formed of 17 emeralds, each an irregular octahedron. Lying between these gems, touching some of them, sometimes connecting them with each other, were thin, fragile-looking bars of crystal, amber, greenish tourmaline, and honey-pale orichalcum. All these objects did not seem to be floating in the metallic liquid so much as resting upon it, their weight pressing down the surface into shallow depressions, some cup-shaped, others trough-like. The rods glowed faintly, while each of the gems glittered with a light that Pfafford's mind strangely conceived to be refracted starlight. His gaze shifted to the mercurous, heavy fluid, where it bulged up between, and he saw distorted reflections of stars and constellations which he recognized, stars and constellations which would be visible now in the sky overhead were it not for the concealing brilliance of the sun. An awesome wonder engulfed him. His gaze shifted back to the gems. There was something tremendously meaningful about their complex arrangement, something that seemed to speak of overwhelming truths in an alien symbolism. More. There was a compelling impression of inner movement, of sluggish thought, of inorganic consciousness. It was like what the eyes see when they close at night. Not utter blackness, but a shifting, fluid pattern of many colored points of light. Feeling that he was reaching impiously into the core of a thinking mind, Pfafford gripped with his right hand for the diamond as big as a man's skull. The Mouser blundered through the doorway. There could be no mistaking it now. The close-mortised stones were trembling. That bloody smear, as if the ceiling had champed down upon the holy man, crushing him against the floor, or as if the floor had struck upward. But there was the girl, her terror-wide eyes fastened upon him, her mouth open for a scream that did not come. He must drag her away out of the clearing. But why should he feel that a fearful threat was now directed at himself as well? Why should he feel that something was poised above him, threatening? As he stumbled down the terraced steps, he looked over his shoulder and up. The tower. The tower! It was falling. It was falling toward him. It was dipping at him over the dome. But there were no fractures along its length. It was not breaking. It was not falling. It was bending. Pfafford's hand jerked back, clutching the great, strangely faceted jewel, so heavy that he had difficulty in keeping his hold upon it. Immediately the surface of the metallic, star-reflecting fluid was disturbed. It bobbled and shook. Surely the whole house was shaking too. The other jewels began to dart about erratically, like water insects on the surface of a puddle. The various crystalline and metallic bars began to spin. Their tips attracted now to one jewel and now to another, as if the jewels were lodestone and the bars iron needles. The whole surface of the fluid was in a whirling, jerking confusion that suggested a mind gone mad because of loss of its chief part. For an agonizing instant, the Mouser stared up in amazement, frozen at the club-like top of the tower, hurling itself down upon him. Then he ducked and lunged forward at the girl, tackling her, rapidly rolling over and over with her. The tower top struck a sword's length behind them, with a thump that jolted them momentarily off the ground. Then it jerked itself up from the pit-like depression it had made. Fafhrd tore his gaze away from the incredible alien beauty of the jewel-confused cavity. His right hand was burning. The diamond was hot. No, it was cold beyond belief. By cost, the room was changing shape. The ceiling was bulging downward at a point. He made for the door, then stopped dead in his tracks. The door was closing like a stony mouth. He turned and took a few steps over the quaking floor toward the small low window. It snapped shut like a sphincter. He tried to drop the diamond. It clung painfully to the inside of his hand. With a snap of his wrist, he whipped it away from him. It hit the floor and began to bounce about, glaring like a living star. The mouser and the peasant girl rolled toward the edge of the clearing. The tower made 2 more tremendous bashes at them, but both went yards wide, like the blows of a blind madman. Now they were out of range. The mouser lay sprawled on his side, watching a stone house that hunched and heaved like a beast, and a tower that bent double as it thumped grave-deep pits into the ground. It crashed into a group of boulders, and its top broke off, but the jaggedly fractured end continued to beat the boulders in wanton anger, smashing them into fragments. The mouser felt a compulsive urge to take out his dagger and stab himself in the heart. A man had to die when he saw something like that. Fafhrd clung to sanity because he was threatened from a new direction at every minute, and because he could say to himself, I know, the house is a beast and the jewels are its mind. Now that mind is mad. I know. Walls, ceiling, and floor quaked and heaved, but their movements did not seem to be directed especially at him. Occasional crashes almost deafened him. He staggered over rocky swells, dodging stony advances that were half bulges and half blows, but that lacked the speed and directness of the tower's first smash at the mouser. The corpse of the holy man was jolted about in grotesque mechanical reanimation. Only the great diamond seemed aware of Fafhrd. Exhibiting a fretful intelligence, it kept bounding at him viciously, sometimes leaping as high as his head. He involuntarily made for the door as his only hope. It was champing up and down with convulsive regularity. Watching his chance, he dived at it just as it was opening and writhed through. The diamond followed him, striking at his legs. The carcass of Ranash was flung sprawling in his path. He jumped over it, then slid, lurched, stumbled, fell down the stairs, an earthquake where dry bones danced. Surely the beast must die. The house must crash and crush him flat. The diamond leaped for his skull, missed, hurtled through the air, and struck a wall. Thereupon it burst into a great puff of iridescent dust. Immediately, the rhythm of the shaking of the house began to increase. Fafhrd raced across the heaving floor, escaped by inches the killing embrace of the great doorway, plunged across the clearing, passing a dozen feet from the spot where the tower was beating boulders into crushed rock, and then leaped over 2 pits in the ground. His face was rigid and white. His eyes were vacant. He blundered bull-like into 2 or 3 trees, and only came to a halt because he knocked himself flat against one of them. The house had ceased most of its random movements, and the whole of it was shaking like a huge dark jelly. Suddenly, its forward part heaved up like a behemoth in death agony. The 2 smaller domes were jerked ponderously a dozen feet off the ground, as if they were the paws. The tower whipped into convulsive rigidity. The main dome contracted sharply like a stupendous lung. For a moment it hung there, poised. Then it crashed to the ground in a heap of gigantic stone shards. The earth shook. The forest resounded. Battered atmosphere whipped branches and leaves. Then all was still. Only from the fractures in the stone, A tarry black liquid was slowly oozing, and here and there iridescent puffs of air suggested jewel dust. Along a narrow, dusty road, 2 horsemen were cantering slowly toward the village of Sorive in the southernmost limits of the land of Lankmar. They presented a somewhat battered appearance. The limbs of the larger, who was mounted on a chestnut gelding, showed several bruises, and there was a bandage around his thigh and another around the palm of his right hand. The smaller man, the one mounted on a grey mare, seemed to have suffered an equal number of injuries. "Do you know where we're headed?" said the latter, breaking a long silence. "We're headed for a city, and in that city are endless houses of stone towers without numbers, streets paved with stone, domes, archways, stairs. Tcha! If I feel then as I feel now, I'll never go within a bowshot of Lankmar's walls." His large companion smiled. "What now, little man? Don't tell me you're afraid of earthquakes."